Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today, my guest is Ryan Rogers, a graduate student in counseling and the author of The Woke Mind. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
How's it going?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here with you.
Now, we, like many of the guests on this program, you and I connected through Twitter. How has Twitter been for you? Have you been on Twitter long?
I think I probably joined it in maybe 2009 or something like that, but I didn't use it at all up until really the last year. And it was reaching out to find like-minded people because I felt so isolated and alienated being in academia in a very, very foreign environment.
Has that paid off?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been great connecting with people like you and finding out there's alternative voices and not everyone is in the kind of, social justice hive mind, you might say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When did you write your book?
So I wrote a series of books, it was really just me trying to figure out, explain to myself what I was seeing in academia. And so I wrote a series of 5 books about the social justice movement and realized that most people are probably not going to read 5 books. So I condensed it down to one book, which is The Woke Mind. And it's essentially, explaining how social justice ideology, which teaches you to see the world in a very negative light, to call things problematic and look for microaggressions, look for oppression everywhere around you, that's going to naturally foster some neuroticism, oftentimes paranoia, a negative outlook. It's going to lead to depression, anxiety. Seeing problems in the world around you is going to lead naturally to emotional instability. And that's going to lead to very irrational behaviors. And I think that's what we've seen the last few years with the riots of 2020, with a lot of the hysteria around the trans movement, especially around kids. A lot of those things are tied directly to the ideology that you can eventually, if you go back far enough, trace back to Karl Marx.
Sure. We should just say your Twitter account and a lot of what you create is around a concern with the politicization of the mental health industry, if you even want to call it that. Is that something you've seen working out at the graduate level in your time? And are you a year into school, 2 years into graduate school?
So let's see. What is this? I'm about 2.5 years into school, and I'm just starting my practicum this week, actually. So I just start seeing clients, and it's almost, I feel like I have to have a caveat before I even start talking about this. I feel like a few years ago, if you had told me, academia has been taken over by radical Marxists, I would assume this is some boomer conservative that's just having a hysterical meltdown, And now, having been on the inside for a few years, if anything, conservatives might be underselling it. The level of politicization is just off the charts. I really learned that in my first couple of weeks in graduate school. You're doing privilege walks where, essentially the theme of a privilege walk is every time you have a point of privilege, you take a step forward and you have this wadded up piece of paper and you're supposed to dump it in the trash can at the end. And the message they're trying to send is, for example, if you're a heterosexual white male, none of your accomplishments are really that important because it was all essentially handed to you from your privilege. You had in my counseling the culturally diverse class, you start off day one by announcing your pronouns. They set the tone very early on. I remember my professor for that class told us maybe in the second or third week of class that your primary purpose as a counselor, as a therapist, is to become a political activist so that you can, quote, burn it all to the ground. And I just remember being shocked by that. My work background is in addiction treatment, helping people with alcoholism and substance abuse. And I've seen a lot of people die from overdose and suicide. So helping people with their mental health is extremely important to me. And it seemed like that was at best a secondary issue in my grad program. And number one was always social justice.
What's wrong with that?
I think even if you assume that they're correct on the issue, that let's say 90% of a person's problems are due to, let's say, the capitalist system. Essentially, what you're telling people is, I can't help you with your substance abuse or your bipolar disorder or your anxiety or depression. We can't help you with that until we overthrow the capitalist system and set up a socialist society. And since we've yet to do that, you're basically telling people we're not really that concerned with your mental health. But if there's even 10% of it is on the person or within the person's sphere of being able to change things, it seems like that's what we should focus on. So first of all, that's just pragmatically, that seems like the most obvious area of focus. You can't, decide how Congress votes in a one-on-one session in therapy, right? You can only affect what's happening in that room. You have a very limited ability to affect one other person. And the other thing is, a lot of the social justice ideas, in my opinion, are very off base from reality. It's teaching people to see oppression in kind of bizarre ways, almost fostering hallucination, especially when you look at microaggressions. You could say something like, I believe America is the land of opportunity, and you're taught that that's kind of a hateful phrase that's meant to alienate and ostracize people. Almost anything that you say could be potentially construed as a microaggression. So if you have an Asian client, for instance, asking her what she eats for dinner, that's considered a microaggression. It can lead to paranoia on everyone's part that you're afraid to offend someone, and so actually you're getting less depth in therapy because you're afraid, because anything could potentially be a landmine of offense.
And so part of what's wrong is that it cripples the therapeutic enterprise.
Yes.
Two things strike me as you're talking. Number one, it seems to me that the very foundational idea of therapy at all is that the human person, the human mind, operates according to understandable processes that are universal. And so that's the assumption that allows a therapist to have an office that anyone can come to. So that if you want to begin breaking that up and to say your Asian client has this kind of process, and that based on your identity, your psychological growth process is totally unlike that of someone with another identity, that you're almost undermining the very idea that therapy is even possible. Because isn't the implication that unless your identity and all of the things that make it unique radiate out from you in a way that forms a new society, so that you are not in any way alienated from any part of society, that you can't, like, I guess what you're saying, you can't yourself make any progress because you have an identity that's somehow at odds with some portion of society.
It's kind of self-contradictory, because in one sense they're telling you that as a white man, I could never possibly understand someone from another race or another culture. Mm-hmm. And also, I need to spend all of my time trying to understand people from other races and other cultures. And this really doesn't line up with my experience. I've worked in the addiction treatment space for a long time, and people of all different races, they want to get better. They want to be empowered. They generally don't want to be infantilized and treated like a helpless victim. It just doesn't square with what I see in the real world, I guess.
It's very interesting. I've also worked in addiction treatment, and I can think of Hispanic clients, African American clients, et cetera, with whom I had very good relationships and who made progress during their time in treatment. And what they have in common, all of these clients, was that they were poor. I worked in a facility funded by Medicaid. And it strikes me that they're poor and they have very few social justice concerns,
Mm.
whereas your professors are not poor.
Hmm.
And that there is a kind of class concern here. And that if you have worked with people, if you've done something akin either to social work or drug and alcohol um, treatment, you have a lot of experience with people who are financially disenfranchised, let's say,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And who do not have the kind of privilege that a well-paid university professor has. And it strikes me that there's a correlation between the level of privilege and the seriousness with which the social justice program gets taken.
I think that's something that gets missed a lot of times by both the right and the left about how, the social justice movement is not this bottom up, outcry of marginalized voices. It's very affluent, very well educated people. I like to say if you know what words like non-binary or gender fluid means, you probably went to college. You're probably not that concerned about making the next rent payment. You know what I mean? But when you work with clients of all different races, say at an addiction treatment center, I think ideology becomes significantly less important, regardless of how you vote. It's just not that important compared to can we keep a needle out of this person's arm for the next 24 hours? Can
Hmm.
we keep a bottle out of this person's mouth? It becomes very much very earthy, I guess, rooted in very nuts and bolts of reality. Like what is pragmatically going to work? I remember I did at Baylor. There were certain for my undergrad. There were certain areas that were most of the university was not very woke, but certain areas were. And I did you and Narcan is
Hmm.
that helps reverse overdose.
Yes.
And it was probably like an hour long Narcan training. And the new Narcans, it's just a nasal spray. Like this
Yeah.
training should take, 10 seconds, just spray, spray, and, it starts working. But we've got to talk about the multicultural angle and the social justice angle. And it's just kind of an excuse to talk about all these things. Whereas if you're actually in those environments, those
Mhm.
things are just not as important to you. This is mainly kind of a pastime of the elites.
How have the powers that be in your program responded to your being critical of them publicly?
So I don't think they know about my social media presence, but in terms of how I push back in class,
Hmm.
um, I would say the way they draw the boundaries is so expansive. You know, I was telling somebody you would never just come out and say, "I don't believe in transition for children." You would never go that far
As a student.
as a student. I mean, I remember in fact it's kind of, it's almost like walking on eggshells even being just around other students. I remember I was in a group project with this other guy and we're kind of hinting at it. It's the way this is kind of a crude example, but I have a addiction background myself. It's kind of like when I was in college, if you wanted to bust out some drugs, you had to make sure everybody's real cool. You know what I
Mm.
mean? It's the same way with questioning social justice ideology. You got to kind of make sure people are cool before you before you talk about it. And so this guy and I were kind of going back and forth saying, I don't know about everything. And we're kind of giving a little bit each one of us. And then he leans over and he goes, listen, man, I have 3 kids. I'm not okay with transitioning kids. And so there's sometimes when you get people out of class, they're willing to be honest, but
Mhm.
there's certain things that I've pushed back on in class. I mean, this is an example of how extreme some of the ideology is. There was one time I said I think sometimes the concept of objective reality can be useful in therapy, and you would act like I just kicked a puppy or something. It just seemed so horrifically offensive, like I was defending the white male patriarchy or. And I tried to give an example. I was like, okay, what if there's an abusive man who's denying it, and that's his truth that he was never abusive, right?
Uh-huh.
Shouldn't the truth that he actually was abusive, shouldn't that matter? Like, wouldn't that help the woman who's the victim? And it was so hard for them to wrap their heads around the idea that objective reality could be useful. They're just so postmodern.
Hmm. How did they get like that?
How did they get like that? depends on how far back you want to trace the origins. Um, I think the therapy profession is uniquely vulnerable to being hijacked
Mm.
because empathy is considered so important. Um, that you kind of get on this track where you don't want to offend anyone. You have to affirm everything that the client says. Their truth is most important. You kind of have to go down this trail. And at one point, some of this could have made sense. Let's say being sensitive to a client who has trauma. That's a really good idea. But
Mhm.
then you get to this idea, it's like, well, we're, affirming a client who's dealing with severe mental illness who says that they want to undergo gender transition surgery that's going to be permanent and going to leave them with a lot of health issues, and instead of some degree of confrontation that could potentially save their life, it's like, no, I affirm your truth.
It seems to me that when you center empathy, you do that because specifically you center empathy when empathy is understood, as you said, as universal affirmation of every essentially it sounds like every essential every belief of the client,
Mm.
and that and it's as opposed to sort of understanding empathy as a kind of capacity to share in the feeling of another. When you center empathy understood that way, you do so because you have a specific idea about what therapy is. From your experience, what do the people in your program think therapy is?
That's a really good question. Gosh, that's a very good question.
Go ask them on Monday or next time.
Yeah, yeah. There's kind of this mindset where the primary issue of importance is social justice, and the therapy part is secondary. And you kind of talk around these issues a lot more than you actually talk about the therapy itself. So it's difficult to conceptualize, and different people have their own theories. Some are postmodern, some are Gestalt, but it kind of always comes back to that. Like the political project always has to be in the back of your mind. And it was interesting. I was talking to a professor one time and I said, listen, I come from an addiction background. What if I have a client who is a heroin addict who says, I want to do heroin because it's good for me? I said, that's their truth. And the professor thought for a second and he said, well, if it's a heterosexual white male client who comes from a middle class background, you might be able to confront them about that. But for any other client, that is their truth. Right. And so that's very interesting because the more privileged client, you're actually able to do an intervention that could save their life. But a less privileged client, you have to give them essentially subpar therapy.
And have to give them essentially a pass on doing something that could kill them.
Yes.
So you're saying that from their point of view, therapy is fundamentally about a kind of political awakening, a kind of political revolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in order to hold that therapy is fundamentally about political revolution, you have to also hold a particular view of the person. And I'm assuming from what you're saying that the view of the person that's being held there is also purely political in the sense that white male heterosexual whatever uh, are the oppressors. Really, it's traditional Western culture is the oppressor, and everyone else is the oppressed. Seems to me that leads to a very flat understanding of what a person is. You you track with that?
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I
And
mean,
because you only exist in this political dimension, and it's so that if the highest end of a person is political revolution, then what that means is that a person is essentially a being who finds his or her fulfillment in a in hoping for a political revolution that will likely never come.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? I guess I'm thinking out loud as I go. But what I'm saying is that it seems to me that as you're describing it, what is happening is that the the goal of therapy is no longer increased functioning of the person or the resolution of some inner suffering, but rather a deeper commitment to political revolution.
I'm not sure how deep down the conspiracy rabbit hole you want to go, but a lot of kind of, between French postmodernism and the German critical theorists,
Uh-huh.
a big part of their understanding, because in the 20th century, it was basically almost completely discrediting Marxism, both as a political project in the real world and as a theory. And so they kind of had to reconceptualize things. And one of the things they came up with is we need to breed discontent. We need to
Mm.
cause distress. Herbert Marcuse calls this the power of negative thinking.
Mm.
You have these different French theorists like Deleuze and Guattari who talk about schizoanalysis, how we want to push people towards psychosis because that's the healthy response to a capitalist system, right?
Right.
So, depending on how rooted they are in these classical theorists, and the social justice movement very much is rooted in those theorists, depending on how much they draw on those, you're actually not trying to make people better. You're not trying to relieve their distress. You're trying to create more distress because more distress is what they would see as an accurate or healthy response to a capitalist system. And so that's going to push you to political activism and to overthrow the system and that kind of thing.
Given that, why should anyone ever go to therapy?
I mean, yeah,
Let me let
yeah.
me rephrase my question or expand my question a little bit. You are being educated in this way, but eventually want to enter a marketplace where people will come to you for a service. But you're also telling me that the core of your education really comes down to the how do I increase the suffering of my clients so that that can be used to foment political revolution. Why? But mostly people go to therapy want to feel better,
Mhm.
and and so isn't it the case that in some way proceeding through this manner of training therapists undermines the realistic economic viability of the mental health industry itself? Because
I
who wants to
yeah.
go to that?
I definitely agree with that. It does not seem like a sustainable business model, but I think even describing it as a business model, they would say, "Oh, you're giving in to the capitalist, ideology and that kind of thing." It's kind of assumed that the whole project, the purpose of the project of therapy, is for their political views, and that people coming to therapy are going to share in that, and that they're going to, you know, you almost might say that it could be a trade-off between level of distress and feelings of meaning and purpose. So you might have more anxiety and depression, but you might have more of a sense of meaning and purpose that you're part of this grand political project, that you're on the right side of history, these kind of things. But it's almost inconceivable to them that like a conservative would want to come to therapy, or like what would even be the purpose of that other than maybe to shake them of their silly views kind of thing. I had a professor who was a Latina woman, and she described the situation where she had a Latina client, and she was so excited because she assumed that they would agree on everything. And this woman was a Trump supporter, and she's just so confused. She didn't know how to do therapy with her. And I had a classmate. This was kind of interesting. In one of our classes, the professor, we're broken up into small groups, and the professor said, the question we were supposed to discuss is, how are you going to be a social justice warrior for counseling? And a woman in my group said, well, I'm going to vote like my clients would want me to vote. And I said, well, how do you know how they want you to vote? And there's this like look of shock on her face. She goes, what if I get a Trump supporter as a client? We're taught to respect every conceivable identity, But this, 70 plus million people who voted for Donald Trump, that they're almost like subhuman. They're just icky people that you don't really want near you, kind of thing.
It's so fascinating that, and I suppose this is often the case with hardcore members of the left. Maybe it's true on both sides, but especially for people who are training to be therapists, this sort of habit of regarding others as contaminating. That my client supports Trump, and this is somehow revolting. It
Mm.
is it contaminates me.
Mm.
It's interesting. We were talking earlier about before we started recording about I saw someone on Twitter remarking about conservatives becoming therapists and saying conservatives tend to have a higher disgust response. But it seems to me what you're saying right now is that high disgust response is not limited to the right. Like just the story you just told. What is evidence of a high disgust response? It's just about different things.
Mm.
And so if someone is training to be a therapist and is totally disconcerted that she might have a client who is a Trump supporter, that's evidence of a high disgust response. And and I don't think people on either the left or the right are probably aware of that. And my guess is that high disgust responses correlate mostly with your level of ideological commitment. But the more you are a person who prizes ideological purity, the more you're inclined to have a high disgust response when someone falls outside of your approved circle of being or whatever.
I think a lot of that has to do with how the different researchers who are compiling this data look at it themselves.
Mhm.
So if they say, a conservative doesn't want an undocumented immigrant living next to them, well, that's, a clear example of a disgust response that's, illogical and irrational kind of thing. But, if a progressive doesn't want to sit next to a Trump supporter on an airplane, that's not a disgust response because that's a perfectly legitimate, reasonable thing. They are icky. Like, of course, any rational person wouldn't want to sit next to a Trump supporter. Like, that's how they view it. And so, like, that mindset, that bias filter gets built into the research.
Yeah, I think that's true. The I'm sorry, I keep losing my train of thought. Let me bias filter. Oh, all of this as you're describing it strikes me anthropologically in terms of just the conception of what a human being is as 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 I said, flat versus the sort of traditional Western understanding of the person that we kind of get from our Christian and classical synthesis, where the human being exists in multiple realms, and we have this physical part, and we have a non-physical dimension, we have a soul, whatever you want to call it, going back to Socrates, and that our sense of fulfillment, happiness, stability, etc., is really built around how we manage that non-physical part of us. So in the most obvious example is in Aristotle, who talks about this condition called eudaimonia, where it's the flourishing of the human person. This is brought about by virtue and the cultivation of virtue. And really, there has been a thrust in psychology since Freud, I think, that is aimed at repudiating that tradition. So that in Freud, I mean, part of Freud's goal is to say, well, it's not. He's repudiating Aristotle, who seems to think, well, we have this thing called reason, and from that we can discover what the good is, and then we can conform ourselves to the good. And and I think from the beginning, in Freud, you get this sort of undermining of the very notion that human beings have this independent sort of reasoning faculty that's not just a screen for your underlying socially forbidden desires, right? So you can't really access the good because the goal of your reason is to create a screen that hides you from yourself. So you have these fundamentally different understandings of what the person is, and eventually that gets to, well, if all that is true, and the human being is only this creature sort of trapped in the material realm, what is there but politics and constant fight over power?
Mm.
You see?
I think a lot of this has to do with what Nietzsche called the death of God.
No,
You
oh
know,
yes, say more about that.
because like with Aristotle, you have the analogy of the charioteer with the two horses, the good horse, reason, and
Mhm.
the not so good horse, which is emotion, essentially. And there's kind of this implication, I guess, from the Christian reading of it, is that the good charioteer is kind of guided by God. And
Mhm.
now we've kind of ditched religion, at least mostly in the public sphere. That's the God idea is dead. It's human, but it's not this kind of modern idea where reason rules everything. The postmodern is ditching both God and reason to return to this very like almost primitive, just pure id emotion, to kind of go off of Freud, where you're rejecting all the constraints that have been thrust upon us by this, patriarchal Christian society
Because they're bad.
because they're bad, yes. And where you go from here is like I don't know. I think the joke is at the end of deconstruction, you deconstruct some more. If you tear down all the Christian values or the Western values, what do you have left? Like, how do you run society? I don't think we have an answer to that.
Right. And so then in my view, it falls back on affluence. And I think Theodore Dalrymple is the person who sort of put forward this idea that cognitive and financial elites are happily propone ideas whose consequences they don't have to suffer.
That's like Rob Henderson's
Yeah, so he
luxury
said,
beliefs. Yeah.
yes, he talks about that a lot too. Is that essentially, it sounds to me like you are in a situation where you are being educated by people who indulge in these luxury beliefs, but in fact actually live as if there is a meaning outside of political revolution.
Mm, yeah. I mean, like my professors, they're professors, so they're financially, status wise, professionally, they're doing very well. A lot of them run around to conferences and present as experts and things like that.
Mhm.
So if they say personal responsibility doesn't matter, that's not really how they're living their lives. They're living their lives as though they're trying to succeed. But if I were to tell my client who's struggling, may or may not make the rent this month, if I were to tell them personal responsibility doesn't matter, that could have a huge impact, right? So it's actually very disempowering to people who need it the most.
When I was in graduate school, let's just say I had a disgust response to the obvious hypocrisy of my professors who more or less taught along the same lines, who would say personal responsibility and the idea of personal responsibility, for example, is a result of kind of the imposition of control mechanisms on you. And I would always want to say, well, why, if that's true, are you worried about getting your research paper done in time for the conference?
Mm.
Because isn't the imposition by whichever professional organization's putting on this conference, isn't their imposition of a deadline on you just a way of causing you to conform to a apparatus of control that you ought not to do? And that, of course, you're forbidden to say that, but every day in the actual functioning of the department, it is assumed that everything we're teaching is false.
Mm.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's also really insulting to a lot of people too. Like, I had actually two professors who said, in reference to cognitive behavioral therapy, they said rationality is racist. And it's like, I've worked with a number of black clients. I'm working with black clients right now, and for me to like apply that mentality, first of all, it would be incredibly offensive to them. And second of all, it would not help at all. Helping them reason through their problems and figure out the most logical path forward is something that they want. They want to be empowered. They want to take personal responsibility. They want to escape their troubles. It's just I don't know what mythical world they're talking to where, there's supposedly this group of marginalized people who don't want to be empowered, who want to be, kind of helpless victims.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about the necessity of having a conception of the person that has about it some level of universal, an understanding of universal qualities. And to go back to what I was saying about the sort of classical and Christian synthesis, is that traditionally that has been the idea of reason, a reason as not in an enlightenment sense, but as the capacity to grasp the good
Mm,
and to know what is good for you.
mm.
Okay. And so if you say, well, that is just the invention of white men in Europe in times past. Yes, what's the substitute that you have to offer to non-white people
Well,
for reason?
the ironic thing here is that all of the substitutes, like critical theory and postmodernism, come from rich white European men,
Right.
in Germany and France, right? None of them come from indigenous cultures.
The and so the question is, if you have a African American client, whatever, are you supposed to assume then that that person has less capacity for reason than a white man?
Yeah, that
Re-
seems incredibly racist.
yes. Uh-huh. Just like assuming that because your client is uh, Latina, she won't support Trump, which also seems quite racist to me.
Mhm.
Right? That the assumption that one's race is the sole motivator for one's choices. Now, to be fair, of course, I mean, I think working with clients who do have some sort of minority identity, yes, it might present particular things to be sensitive about, might present particular kinds of historical questions that you have to deal with, et cetera. But to eradicate from that the therapeutic process this notion that there is some aspect of the human being that is universal to all people that we can together meet and work with seems to me to again destroy the whole therapeutic process, the very hope for therapeutic change.
Yeah, I've worked with a number of Black and Hispanic clients who have faced racism in the real world, but it's always viewed as a problem for which we want a solution. At no point are they saying, "Well, I guess I just need to sit here until we overthrow the capitalist system."
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, can I talk to this person? Can I talk to my boss? Can I talk to a third party and see what they're seeing? How do we approach this? How can we make this better? Can I avoid this person? Can I avoid this situation? What are some solutions? They generally want to make the situation better as opposed to just like, well, out there somewhere, maybe if Congress votes a certain way, then my problems will disappear kind of mentality.
The are most of your fellow students women?
Probably over 80% white women, I would say.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing. I was having a conversation on another episode of this program with another therapist who said at this point, the mental health industry, the number of therapists, new therapists, is about 75% women. This does not seem good to me. What do you think about that?
I mean, it could be worse than that. I mean, in my program, it's probably almost 90% female. And, there's certainly advantages of having women in the profession, women on average have different kind of skill sets in terms of social and emotional intelligence. There's a different kind of empathy that women bring to the table. I think that can be very valuable. But I think when the numbers get so skewed, you start to lose something. I think losing that male or masculine perspective can have a damaging effect, especially to a lot of men. And I've talked to a number of men who don't want to go to therapy because they view it as BS or nonsense. I talked to one guy recently, and he talked about, basically kind of what you would imagine as a stereotypical feminized therapy of kind of a coddling, let's heal your inner child kind of thing. And he said he saw a different therapist who was CBT related, very rational, kind of problem solving, solution focused kind of, mentality. And he said he really liked that. So I don't think it's just naturally men don't like therapy. I think men don't feel seen in a lot of ways. And in a different way, when men are seen, a lot of times we're viewed as the bad guys, the perpetrators, the oppressors. Yeah, and that's certainly not really helpful.
And if you're a white male in search of therapy and you go to a therapist who holds the views that you've just been describing, how is it that you would even be able to participate in that therapy except under the assumption that you are an oppressor?
Mm.
And so it seems to me that part of the right therapeutic approach is to take individuals as they are, rather than to begin your therapeutic relationship with an assumption that I know what you are and I know what your problem is. And here, let me give you the solution, which is the renunciation of your privilege and the working for political revolution.
I,
Again, it undermines the therapeutic, even the possibility of a therapeutic relationship.
I will say being a white man does not necessarily negate it doesn't make you a bad guy necessarily right off the start. It means you have fewer strikes though. So if I as a white man were to go to a therapist and say like, "Hey, I'm really worried about going home for Thanksgiving. My dad's a Trump supporter and I just can't handle that toxic environment. There's so much toxic masculinity at that Thanksgiving table." The therapist will be very sympathetic to you. But if you said, "Hey, I'm in my workplace and I there's a coworker who keeps making negative comments about white men and it kind of rubs me the wrong way," then there's a lot of therapists who would want to transition the conversation to, "Well, let's take a look at your privilege. Where are
Mm-hmm.
you acting as an oppressor in this situation?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's certain situations where you're genuinely not going to get the help you need.
And, one of the things we mentioned before is that the disappearance of, before we started recording, is that the disappearance of men largely from the mental health industry and from the therapeutic enterprise is not just that it's bad for men, but that it's bad for women. Is that
Mm.
there are women who want a male therapist, and when those become harder and harder to find, it's not serving anyone necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is going to be a sexist example, but just as an over exaggeration of stereotypes, you might view men and women like Aristotle's horses, where it's like the man has the side of reason and the female has more this, emotional empathy kind of thing. And you need both aspects of masculine and feminine to have a good chariot or a good therapy, in a sense. And you might say that our chariot of therapy has gotten off centered because one horse has a lot more power than the other at this point.
Yes, that at the very least it is happening theoretically, right? In terms of the theoretical orientation of the field, becomes there is an impact on the ideas that emerge into the field when men are essentially driven out of it.
Mm.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. You
And
know, I,
that,
I was talking to a friend the other day, and we were just going back over kind of the history of some therapy, and you had Aaron Beck, Albert Ellis, the CBT, REBT type people, very, very much rationality, kind of you might think a more masculine or, personal responsibility based approach. And then you had Glasser with reality therapy, very much involved in taking personal responsibility. And the way the field has shifted since then has been very much away from personal responsibility and toward victimhood. Some of that is you could be chalked up to the feminization of the field, and I think a lot of it is just the complete wholesale adoption of social justice ideology.
What does that? So, what do you think the future looks like for you?
I'm actually I don't know. In the short term, I really don't know what things look like, but in the long term, I'm very optimistic. I think in the long term, people are going to gravitate towards what works. Whether it's an exercise program, a diet program, or what university are you going to, you go based on like how it's going to help you. And I think if somebody goes to a very affirming therapist for 10 years and never gets any better, people are going to notice that, and they're going to see a different therapist who's has a more rigorous approach, maybe more evidence-based, and they say, hey, this person got better really quickly. Maybe I should go see them. I think over a long period of time, you're going to see a sorting mechanism where things that work are going to rise to the top and things that don't are going to start disappearing.
The other thing we can't ignore in this is the role that licensure plays. That part of the reason that the therapeutic industry can be captured at all is that it is dependent on approval from the government. And that this is, I think, part of the reason why we're seeing a massive rise in coaching as opposed to therapy, because coaching is unregulated, which has its downsides. The upside is that you could get coaching without having this kind of ideological imposition. And so when the licensing boards become captured, essentially it seems to me that the whole industry, if you want to call it that, freezes, because you have to have a master's degree, you have to have licensure, and nothing can happen outside of the power of the people who determine what gets you a license and what gets your license taken away. And so there's a reason that we have so much innovation in, say, technology, AI field, and we have very little innovation now in counseling and mental health. It's part of that is that the AI technology field is unregulated. You can be an AI developer without having to have your state's permission. And so there's a structure that keeps everyone trapped and keeps radicals in charge of it.
If you look at all the codes from the American Counseling Association, the American Psychological Association, the National Association of Social Work, all of them, part of being in those fields is a commitment to social justice. And when you look at what's required, there's virtually no deviation allowed. So gender affirming care is a big one, where recent evidence with the WPATH files and the Cass report, it just is overwhelming. That is not good. That is incredibly harmful to minors. And they're still 100% committed to gender affirming care. The ideology is so rigid that there's no deviation, even if the evidence is overwhelmingly against something.
I think too, it's probably worth noting that, we might be critical of wokeness, so to say, but really the issue is ideological rigidity in this sort of training of therapists. And you could easily, just as easily, be sitting here complaining about a training program where it was so ideologically rigid in terms of traditional or conservative beliefs that we won't even look at the evidence from these important studies. And that the real issue is the level of ideological commitment when it is so great that there's no breathing room for anyone to to even question the basic orthodoxies. And that stifles innovation and it limits your ability to help clients, I would think, ultimately.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think on a big grand level, I think we're seeing a shift right now. I think for many years the left has had complete hegemony over politics, the corporations, nonprofits, academia, media. There's been Hollywood, complete cultural hegemony. And we're seeing a great discrediting of that, and the pendulum is starting to swing hard in the right wing direction, I guess. And is a fairly centrist guy. I'm worried this pendulum is not going to stop in the middle, and we're gonna. I think probably if we were to have this podcast 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about rigidity on the right that's causing problems. I don't think it's specific to the left. Right now, it's the left wing, but in the future, it very well could be right wing rigidity that's causing our issues.
And that the real problem is the politicization of what ought in a way to transcend, not entirely, not to say there's never a political issue with regard to, therapeutic concerns, but in many ways, the therapist's session, it seems to me, ought to be fundamentally about the individual rather than political revolution.
Yeah, I mean, in a number of my classes, you get extra credit. We're in Austin, Texas. In a number of my classes, you get extra credit for going down to the Capitol and protesting for pro-abortion stuff, for pro-gender transition for minors, these type of things. You get extra credit for that. But to me, if I'm working with somebody, I could care less how they vote. And for the most part, I could care less how Congress votes. I guess I have my opinions, but that doesn't really, shape, how I view someone's mental health. It's kind of distantly related, I guess. My main thing is like, how can we relieve distress and get this person back on the right track? And that seems to be a secondary issue in a lot of the field.
Right. So we shall see what the future brings. I do think that we are in the middle of a massive shift culturally. As we're recording this, we are probably a few hours from Trump's second inauguration. So we'll see how the cultural shift works here soon. Tell people where they can buy your book.
So on Amazon, it's The Woke Mind, The Twisted Psychology of the Social Justice Movement.
And where can people find you?
On Twitter or X at Ryan McRogers.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Let's do this again sometime. I think it was a worthwhile conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right. Thank you.